Okay, we are here. Now we can fully chat. Hey, it's the Prospect Weekly Roundup. Welcome once again. We've been doing this for about a month. It's very exciting. Good to see everybody out there in YouTube land. I'm David Dayen, the executive editor. Very excited this time. This is our Philly connection here at the Prospect. I may or may not be wearing my Eagles Super Bowl T-shirt underneath this sweater, but we have Gabrielle Gurley, senior editor. Gabrielle, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Are we going to talk about cheesesteaks, Dan?
We could. I could easily blow a
We
half
could have
hour
a
on
with
cheesesteak.
whiz and without whiz, but I think we'll probably do something a little bit more serious.
D'Alessandro's Bridge Avenue. That's the one. That's the one.
Throw it
No one ever
all the
talked
way
about
down to
that one.
South Philly? Nah.
Yeah, no, down at near where my dad went to college, Philadelphia. Now it's called Philadelphia University. It used to be Philadelphia Textile.
I'm more
Uh,
of a Jim's fan or Cleavers, which is downtown.
ooh, there you go.
Jim's is on South Street.
I know Jim's well. Cleavers, I don't know so well, so I'm going to have to make myself acquainted
Relatively
with that.
new. It's a so-called gourmet cheesesteak.
Oh, okay.
A
Wow.
little bit more
You're not going to
expensive.
get any cheese whiz there, I guarantee you.
No, I'm a provolone girl. So there you
There
go.
you go. All right, we're gonna get into some news now. Although personally, cheesesteak developments in Philadelphia is news, but we're gonna go a little deeper, and we're gonna start with you. You had this piece this week. Um, uh, Sort of, it covered a lot of facets, but it was broadly on the topic of this coming election season and the expectation of a lot of developments that we've seen over the last several years, things like deep fakes, things like disinformation, things that are intended to confuse voters.
Mm.
That I mean, we've seen in primitive form for decades, right? You get something on your car windshield that says "Don't forget to vote Wednesday," that kind of stuff. But it's moved into a much more sophisticated phase. Tell us about what we're about to see.
I think voters are relatively, the average voter is relatively unaware of this. Some people may have heard what happened in New Hampshire with the robocall featuring President Biden. So folks in New Hampshire are certainly familiar with this, but I think the average voter
And what did that robocall say? What
It
was the
said you
point
did
there?
not have to vote this time around in the primary, that you could save your vote until November.
And the
Uh,
voice sounded like Biden,
it
right?
sounded like Biden. If you listen to Biden enough, as a lot of reporters have, you could maybe detect that there was something off about it. But most, 99.9% of people in the United States don't listen to
Right.
Biden on a regular basis. So it was a very convincing. Um,
And it was AI generated, right? I
it
mean,
was
this was
AI. It
open
was AI
AI generated.
generated.
Right.
It seems that folks in New Hampshire caught on pretty quickly that something was off, and the attorney general looked into it right away, and they traced it to an outfit in Texas, actually,
Mm-hmm.
that had pulled it together. But their election officials across the country are really, really concerned about this, and they really fear that it's going to be weaponized. This misinformation, well, more than
Mm-hmm.
misinformation, this is disinformation. It's going to be weaponized after Labor Day, when people are really paying attention, and to be weaponized more and more the closer we get to actual election day. Obviously, people will be early voting, but people's
Mm-hmm.
attention will really start to focus in on that. And a group of election officials appeared before the Senate Rules
The
Committee,
rule, yeah.
yeah, to talk about this. They're really worried about information about wrong polling addresses. the what you mentioned at the top about days of the week that are totally wrong. If a location has had some natural disaster, that there would be incorrect information just put out there about, you know, alternatives to vote. So election officials
Right.
are
And
really
the,
good at
and
this.
the
Mhm.
AI part of it that
Mhm.
gets that makes this a little more pernicious is that this can be very micro targeted. It can sound very credible.
Right.
You know, it can sound like an official communication.
Mhm.
It can take on aspects that will make it even easier. I mean, you know, people are fooled in America all the time, but
Yeah.
it's going to be more difficult to detect, I
Right.
think, is the real problem here, right?
Yeah, and that it will spread on social media
Right,
faster.
right.
Uh, that's really, really a big concern. And when you use um, credible individuals, either known election officials like secretaries of state or mayors or even maybe local celebrities, um,
Hmm.
that can really take this into another plane. And another thing that election officials are worried about are these kinds of problems being generated even faster as we get towards election day itself in
Right.
November. We once talked about October surprises. Well, election officials are worried about election eve surprises. Could
Mm-hmm.
put out
Hmm.
some sort of,
Right.
nugget of disinformation that would
Right.
really turn things upside down really quickly, in a way that they wouldn't be able to respond.
So I got a quick question from Steve in the chat, and it's a good segue into something else that was in your story. He asked if there are any legal remedies to this, and we did see
Mm,
a Supreme Court case this week, Murthy versus Missouri, that kind of touches on this tangentially because the case was about instances of during COVID, actually, of the Biden administration asking social media companies to take down pieces that were untrue,
mm,
take down you know, communications that were were problematic around the vaccine and things like that.
mm.
And you know, I mean, what would the application of that? I mean, first of all, talk about what that those oral arguments were like, and then what the application could be to these kinds of things that we've been talking about with regard to elections.
Well, the case basically revolved around there were instances in Missouri and Louisiana where individuals felt that they were being targeted by social media companies having their posts taken down, either taken down or substantially interfered with, that
Mm-hmm.
caused them to think that their First Amendment uh, uh, rights were being violated.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a line between and these people contended that the government was, quote, coercing them. The federal government was coercing the social media companies,
Right.
you know, saying, if you don't take this down, we will do whatever to
XYZ.
you.
Yeah.
Right. But it's a fine line, and this is something that justices brought out in their questions during oral argument. It's a fine line between coercion and being upset if a government media representatives gets in touch with a company and saying, hey, why don't you do something about this? Please take it down, and throws a fit, then saying threatening, and if you don't take it down, we're going to stick the
Right.
IRS
Which
on you.
is
That's kind of the line.
which there's no indication that that was
Right.
done. It
It
was
seemed to be
right.
bickering that was going on back and forth between
Right.
social media companies and government media representatives that a couple of the justices, Kavanaugh in particular, and I believe Sotomayor, basically said these are things that go on in Washington all the time. Kind of
Right.
this, you know, nitpicking
Yeah.
over things that have been published that federal officials don't like.
And I think what's interesting there is that Kavanaugh and also Roberts worked for the federal government and were in this position in the past. So was Kagan.
Mhm.
And I think that colored their approach to the issue.
Right,
That as long as it wasn't fully coercive, like we're going to bring out the IRS against you or
right,
something
right.
like that, that this was part of the normal back and forth that has happened in the past, and it wasn't necessarily seen as coercive in a legal context.
Mhm.
Um,
One of the things that
I
is,
mean, but
yeah,
you have to guard that against free speech, and
right,
that is this fine line that I think social media companies kind of are flummoxed about figuring
right,
out what to do
exactly.
with it. You know,
I think one of the problems that this case has presented is that it's kind of chilled this dialogue between the social media companies and the government in
right?
responding to the AI social media problem because they're
Right.
afraid that there's going to be some sort of legal liability because of this pending case, which is it's pretty much been the effects have been stayed, but still there's this, well, we really don't want to get mixed up in something that's going to cause us problems down the line. So that's where legal remedies have kind of been stymied. The other place, as far as regulating AI goes, states have done it on a, obviously on a state by state basis. Michigan has a
Mm-hmm.
law that addresses deep fakes and problems that have been attributed to AI that have been substantially interfering or substantially how how should I put this?
Mm-hmm.
Used to fool people. That if
Yeah.
you are putting out an AI generated ad that it really has erroneous information in it, then the state of Michigan is going to
Right.
come after you. But what the panel of election officials basically said was, we really need some federal teeth in this
Yeah.
because, as you can imagine, it's a patchwork of state regulations. A state like Michigan
Right. And
is well
and
regulated, others are
it's
not.
going to get very parochial very quick. I just
Right.
read a story about an AI law in Tennessee that is almost entirely about not being able to copy the voice of a musical artist. Yeah, and you can imagine in
Right.
Nashville, that's the thing that they care about with
That,
respect
yeah,
to
they
AI.
care about
So
that probably even
you'll
more
have
than
50,
the election.
right.
Yeah.
You'll have 50 states with 50 different kind of frameworks and regimes. And especially considering that the election is essentially 50 different state mini elections, that's not going to work to
Right.
have, not to not have one complete standard. So you also mentioned in the story that Europe has taken a step forward with their AI Act, although I have to say that even is a little narrowly focused and targeted. But maybe talk about that aspect of it.
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to dive into their regulate what they've actually done, their regulations. I basically just wanted to mention that
Well, they're the first in the world. I
right,
mean,
they are
they're
the first
really
in the
the
world.
first in the world to do some sort of binding regulatory regime.
Mhm.
Now, it usually takes Europe like a year or two to actually turn that into implementation. And one problem I've heard about with it is that it's really a product safety regulation. It's
Mm.
really about this AI won't have harmful effects, and then they have to define harmful effects, and will do so over the next, 6 months to a year. And that anything generated by AI, it has to be transparent.
Right, right,
That we've generated this, through artificial intelligence. However, other aspects of AI that may be problematic aren't really covered by that regulation. For example, the fact that the largest companies are the ones with all the data and the ability to train and put together an AI model,
mhm.
and that sort of has the tendency of moving, this entire industry upward into the established incumbent players. So there's a lot. I mean, the problem with AI is that it's so. I mean, this has been a problem for our
Right,
coverage of it. Like, I don't even know where to begin. It's you're looking at pieces of
right.
the elephant. It's just there's so much
Sure.
that's possible here
Well, I think,
that,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that the point with the Europeans is that they have been much more aggressive about moving to regulate AI
Yes,
than the United States has.
right.
They recognize the concerns, they recognize the threat, and they have gotten out in the front. And the fact that they have come up with legislation in the period they have
Yeah,
is absolutely amazing. At the
yeah,
hearing, Senator Amy Klobuchar was talking about her bill um, uh, on AI transparency. And as we know, we can't even get a budget. So a
yeah.
bill on AI
I mean,
transparency is not really going anywhere. And that bill, one of the provisions is to indicate, have some sort of indication that AI is being used, for example, in advertising,
right, like a
election ads.
transparency. Yeah.
But one of the technologies available, watermarking watermarking
Mm-hmm.
ad,
Mm-hmm.
that you can take a watermark off an ad very easily. And
Right.
has been research done to indicate that you don't need any special software, you don't need any special expertise. You can, if you're sufficiently savvy, you can figure out how to take a watermark off. So it's
Yeah.
a situation where the technology is outstripping our we in the United States we have an interest in regulating, but
Right.
we haven't really moved fast enough to actually do it.
Yeah.
And the
I mean,
technology is really, light years ahead.
well, this is interesting because this is really the difference between the US and Europe. And I have actually a big piece. I was in Brussels back at the end of January, and I have a big piece coming out on Europe and how they're looking at these particular issues. And
Mhm.
Europe is able to legislate. They certainly are able to. It's not just the AI Act. They have the Digital Markets Act, which just came out, which puts a lot of restrictions on the tech industry. The Digital Service Act as well. They're able to do that. The enforcement has been wanting in Europe. It's largely like the industry dictates what they're going to do, and then the regulators sit back and say, "Oh, okay, maybe that's good, maybe that's not," and then
Mhm.
it hasn't been fully successful. Now in the U.S., we can't regulate we can't legislate at all.
Right. No.
However, at least in the last few years, we have a regime in the executive branch, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission or the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department or CFPB, that really actually has been looking at this stuff pretty closely and trying to use existing tools. For example,
Mhm.
the FTC has come out and said, look, if you are colluding in an industry and price fixing in an industry, but you're doing it through an algorithm, like with this entity called RealPage, which collates all of the rental prices in a community, and then if you know your competitors' prices, you can then move them upward and
Mhm.
have some headroom there without losing market share. They're saying if you do that with software, that's no different than if
Right.
you all went into a room together. So
But it's
there has
piecemeal. That's for
it's
sure.
certainly
That's the
piecemeal
problem.
because it doesn't have binding, a standard regulatory framework through statute. But they are trying to use existing tools, and they're enforcing quite
Yeah.
rigorously using those existing tools. So it's kind of like the difference between US and Europe, and we'll
Yeah,
have more
the
of that.
Europeans, it seems, have struck a little bit more fear into the media companies and social media companies in particular than because here in the US we can't get our acts together, that they're less concerned in some
Well, I
respect.
mean, this week we saw the U.S. Sue Apple
Mm,
over the iPhone, and that is the fourth of four monopolization lawsuits that have been put together against now Amazon, Facebook,
mm,
Google, and now Apple. So we are seeing movement on that front, but
yeah.
ultimately you're going to hit a wall if you don't get some legislative
Right,
remedies in
exactly.
there and get your act together.
You use the tools that you have, but what the tool that you need is
Yeah,
a legislative tool. Uh,
ultimately there's going to be a gap there, definitely.
yeah.
Well, let's move on to another item here. I know you only have a few minutes left with us, and then we're going to bring in Luke Goldstein. And Luke actually has a piece up today about something that you've also written about,
Hmm.
which is the U.S. Senate race in Maryland.
Hmm.
This is replacing the retiring Ben Cardin. And everybody thought initially this was just going to be a ho hum. Let's see who the Democrats pick, and
Hmm.
that'll be your senator for the next 30 years or whatever. And then Larry Hogan, who was the two-time governor, Republican governor of Maryland, decided to jump into this race, and he's really scrambled it to the extent that the latest polls that I've seen from the Washington Post show him starting out with a double-digit lead. Obviously, that's because of name recognition as much as anything, but it's certainly a major concern to a Democratic Party that is a pretty tenuous hold on the U.S. Senate to begin with. So you wrote about the Hogan side of this a couple weeks ago. So why don't you tell us what your thoughts are about that race? Do you think that he can maintain that large lead forever? Or there are going to have to be some come to Jesus moments here
Yeah.
with certain of his policies.
I really don't think that Hogan can maintain that large lead because of the abortion issue. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
he is known to be personally anti-abortion. He made some moves during his administration. One in particular, Maryland, they wanted to have nurse practitioners and midwives be able to perform
Mm-hmm.
abortions. He vetoed that. The veto, the Maryland legislator, which has a supermajority of Democrats, um, overrode the veto, and then he proceeded to hold up funding. And Westmore, the current governor, a Democrat, came in and restored the funding to that. So he
Mm-hmm.
is well known for his um, interest in setting back abortion regulation. And the concern, of course, is that who Mitch McConnell,
Right.
Senator McConnell, was among those who persuaded him to throw his hat into the ring.
Right.
So although he has said he's made all the right noises so far, or tried to work around this issue, because there are some noises that he is now backing away from. He is a known quantity in Maryland. This is not a new issue in Maryland. He's a known quantity, and although he is very personally popular, Democrats are registered 2-1
Yeah.
from
I mean, I think it's the
Republicans.
difference.
So
Yeah. I think it's the difference between being a governor and being a senator. So if you're a
yeah,
governor, even though you described that one particular issue with regard to nurses, you're not going to have a ton of opportunities to weigh in on abortion in a way that sets national policy. And
exactly.
if you're a senator, you are like, this is going to be front and center throughout the election. Trump is playing footsie with endorsing a 15-week national ban.
Right.
Uh, every time something like that comes up, Larry Hogan running in this for this Senate seat is going to be asked about it, and he was just asked a couple days ago, and he kind of tried to dodge the issue,
Right.
and
He's been
that's not
dodging
going to
the issue.
fly.
Yeah, that's not going to work. And I'm sure there's probably been some sort of quid pro quo made um, to help him persuade him to run. He's going to be in the kind of weird position that perhaps Susan Collins, would make all the right noises of Maine, would make all the right noises about abortion in the
Right.
to vote on, Supreme Court justices and what have you. So I think Marylanders are well aware of that. It's going to be a question of is his personal policy, and there's also an abortion amendment on the ballot,
Well, there you
which
go.
will keep
Hmm.
that front and center for Marylanders. So is his
But
personal
then there are
policy
other.
going to trump this? I don't know.
I mean, there are other issues too, though, right? I mean, you actually talked to Westmore just this week about the transportation side of this and what Hogan did, particularly to Baltimore, and how that will play into the race. It's not like Hogan's going to get. I mean, I don't think Hogan won two terms in Maryland by winning Baltimore, but
No,
but but at
Baltimore
the
is a
same
small percentage of the electorate. Yeah.
at the same time, I think this issue, could play for those in the Baltimore suburbs. So, what tell us about that?
Baltimore, most of the East Coast cities have a robust, relatively robust subway systems. Philadelphia, New York, DC, Boston.
Right.
Baltimore is about the same size as DC, and Boston has one subway line, one rather pathetic subway line that some people don't even know about. Um, Baltimore could have had a light rail system, but yeah, Larry Hogan gave back $1 billion that was to be dedicated for that
Mm,
system. Just gave it back. And Baltimore has not forgotten that. And
right.
Maryland has not forgotten that. And Westmore certainly is on a mission to restart that project. So what's going to be hammered home against Larry Hogan is he gave back $1 billion to the federal government because he thought it was a quote unquote wasteful boondoggle. And Larry Hogan is going to be hearing those two words quite a bit between now and election day. Um, there is also a project that for which Maryland did not get any money, a roadworks project, a highway project that affects the District Maryland, Virginia, that Larry Hogan had started and did not go through, at least for this round of federal grants. Maryland is kind of divided on public transportation. A lot of people drive, but for the capital, for the largest city in the state, Baltimore, the question of public transportation really resonates, and the
Yeah.
deed that was done against them is still smarts, if you will. And there are plenty of people who have lined up to remind him of that at every opportunity. And the folks in the Maryland suburbs of the District of Columbia are well aware of what happened to Baltimore and the fact that there is another light rail line that is being built that serves those suburbs, but Baltimore lost out. And people are aware of that. So Hogan has a lot of negatives going against him, as you rightly point out. He was a
Yeah.
governor, and it's a different ecosystem than being in a closely divided Senate, if that's what we
Right.
get in
I
November.
mean, he has a running mate, and that's the Republican Party. And he didn't
Exactly.
really have that running mate when he was running for governor in
Yeah.
Maryland.
And although
We
he's
have,
been very aggressive in his, back and forth with Donald Trump, that's not necessarily going to help him this time around.
yeah. We have one last question. I know you got to go, and we have one last question from Anthony. And this goes back to our discussion about AI and deepfakes and things like that. Does the old-fashioned notion of false advertising potentially come to play here as a way to prosecute fakes, or does that fall outside of that because it's political speech? That's a good question. I mean, political
Is a good
advertising
question.
has always kind of stood apart
Mhm.
from the typical notions of truth in advertising laws and things like that. However, I mean, you do see that pop up occasionally in political ads when they're determined to be false. There's a lot of pressure on the media outlet that runs them to take them down and things like that. So I think that those kinds of things, I don't know in terms of prosecution, but it might work in sort of at the local level of, is this
Mhm.
news station going to run something that has a deep fake in it?
That's
Is it
that's
going to broadcast it?
that's a good question. I think we might get some clarity out of what the justices decide.
Mm-hmm.
Murthy, that may put some guardrails around certain things. But it's kind of a wait and see kind of
We're in
proposition.
uncharted territory. I
Yeah.
mean, we're just in complete uncharted territory. So we're going to be figuring this out as we go along. Gabrielle, thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next time on the weekly roundup.
Okay, take care.
All right, see ya. And now I'm going to bring in Luke Goldstein. Luke is our writing fellow here at the Prospect. How you doing, man?
Hey,
Can you?
how's it
Oh,
going?
there
It's
you
good to
are.
be back.
I'm good. I'm good. So we were just talking about one side of the Maryland Senate race, particularly the Larry Hogan side of the equation. But you wrote today about the Democratic side of the equation. Now, before Hogan got into the race, this was expected that the primary would be the general election, and whoever won this would win in a heavily Democratic state. Now there's going to be a fight in November. But tell us about the two candidates who are running for the nomination on the Democratic side in the Maryland Senate race.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so as you mentioned, this primary was kind of a little bit slept on before Larry Hogan got involved. But, as one operative I was talking to recently last week or something said, I mean, this is ground zero for any Democratic hopes to hold on to their Senate majority. So people are definitely really kind of scrutinizing this primary now where there's a big national spotlight on it. So there's really the field's narrowed now down to really two candidates. So it's Congressman David Trone, who got elected in 2018. Before that, debatably currently still, he's a wine mogul. He co-owns Total Wine, which is a giant liquor retailer. And then he's up against Angela Also Brooks, who's the Prince George County executive and was, formerly a state prosecutor before that. So, there's quite a kind of clash here. Angela Also Brooks represents Prince George County, has deep roots there. It's a historically Black area. And, the votes of Black communities are going to be really important in that primary, which kind of sets up the dynamic that I get into in this piece where, I think maybe before we get into that, there's not so much a clash of progressive versus moderate in this primary as we've, seen in other races.
Right.
Both are really trying to kind of lay claim to being the progressive in the race, but the way they're doing that is very different.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two core aspects of your story. So let's dispense with the one, and then we'll get to the fun one. So the one part of this is the divide between national Democrats and local Democrats in this race is kind of interesting. Talk about that.
Yeah, right. So yeah, it really is a contrast of national versus state party interests. So David Trone has, at this point, essentially the full backing of the Democratic leadership of the Democratic caucus, in Washington. So Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Pete Aguilar, and also the whip, Catherine Clark.
Now, just real quick, you didn't get into this, but the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, they have not expended any resources for Trump, correct?
No,
Right.
that's right.
It's just the leadership in the sort of Democratic establishment in the House where Trump serves is backing him.
Right, and along with over 30 other congressional members as well. Yeah.
Many of whom Trump has given money to, correct?
Yeah, so that's what I get into. I mean, and just to kind of underscore this point, if you click on David Trone's campaign page right now, you get a big picture of him next to Hakeem Jeffries as the first pop-up, right? Okay. So that's really what he's trying to emphasize here. So before Larry Hogan got involved, which kind of changed the dynamic, David Trone had really two main assets. One is that he's a prolific self-funder. I mean, he's pumped just an astronomical amount of his own personal fortune into this race at 34 million right now. And that has a few, has values for the national party because it saves their campaign arms resources that they get to put into other races.
Right. But that didn't mean so much when this was a Maryland race where really the winner of the primary was going to win the election. That really, the ability to self-fund really only means something in a contested race where actually money is going to have to be spent. And so you would think that Trone would have a bit more of an advantage here in the eyes of national Democrats because they would say, oh, well, we're going to have to spend a lot of money to stop Larry Hogan. Trone can do that himself. Whereas if Also Brooks comes in, we're going to have to use that funding. But then Trone made this really weird comment where he said, look, I can't do all this by myself against Hogan. This was like right after Hogan got into the race. And he sort of blunted his own best characteristic, which is the ability to expend part of his fortune. But he basically said, I'm not going to be able to do that. And so now the scales seem a little more even. The other part of this is that also Brooks is winning this support from the Maryland delegation specifically, who works with Trone, fairly closely. So I mean, that's an interesting aspect.
Yeah, I mean, they're just they have two they're two values on both sides, and I think that this is getting much more. There's much more focus on this now that it's actually a really contested race. The point being, David Trone, it was a self-funder and has just been a big fundraiser for the Democratic Party in recent years.
Right.
He's given $1.3 million to the D-Trip and also to the House Leadership PAC, which is closely aligned with Pelosi and now
House Majority PAC. Yeah.
And you can kind of follow the money and you sort of see what's going on here. Angela also Brooks, I think, on her side, basically her endorsements are people that, she's worked really closely in government with for a number of years. Most prominently is the current governor, Wes Moore, who's, seen as this rising star in the party. And there's definitely a bit of a clash between Washington leadership versus, this new up and comer.
But also the other senator, Chris Van Hollen, has supported also Brooks. Steny Hoyer, who represents, I think in part represents Prince George's County. But has, he's the dean of the Maryland congressional delegation, and has worked with Trone for the last 5 years, is supporting also Brooks. I think it's really kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's some key figures who have still been on the sidelines. So Jamie Raskin is the main one who was kind of people were talking he was going to get into the race.
Yeah, he ran against Trone and beat Trone, despite Trone funding to the tune of millions of dollars in a congressional seat. Then another one opened up and Trone went next door basically and won that race. But here's the really interesting aspect of this that you can describe is that Trone, in clearly a pitch to progressive voters, is trying to position himself as a victim of the criminal justice system. And you have to explain what he means by that.
So there's quite a bit to get into, and let's just say also he's in a little bit of hot water right now because he accidentally used a racial slur in a budget committee hearing, which is not really helping his case.
This was yesterday, by the way. So that's not great. But tell us about this criminal justice system thing.
So so essentially the dynamic is that, as I've mentioned, Angela also Brooks has really strong pull with Black communities in Maryland that know her, that she's worked with. David Trone has tried to kind of undercut some of her support and also make inroads with kind of progressive voters by portraying himself as this victim of the criminal justice system, which is, he says, a personal issue, and he's been an advocate for many years. Worked with the ACLU, gave a $15 million donation to them, and then they named a program after him based on recidivism. And for Trone, the personal story starts with this incident in the 1990s when he was starting up his company, Total Wine. So the backdrop is that we have this patchwork of state laws across the country that are in place to protect independent, liquor stores from like big box chains, such as what Total Wine has become. They call it the Amazon or the Walmart of liquor retail, just to give you a sense of how they operate. And Trone, doesn't like these laws. He thinks it gets in his way. So what he does in the 90s is he has his wife, his brother, and several friends set up stores in their names because there are restrictions on how many, chains you can own.
Right. So he's getting around these laws by using his own family as straw purchasers, basically straw
just to
owners.
Have their names. Yeah. Those stores hire his consultancy to basically run all the nuts and bolts of the operation. And just to be clear, like he's said this on record that this is
just like someone who gets pulled over by a cop. This is,
Right,
this
right,
is
exactly.
exactly the same thing.
So this is in Pennsylvania. The state authorities go after him all the way up to the state attorney general. And there's some murkiness about the case. The attorney general did end up going to prison on a separate, unrelated corruption charge. So the charges were very severe. He would have actually gone to prison. He fought this case for a number of years, and it ended up just kind of going away. He was not
Right.
convicted, but this is his kind of, as you know, you could maybe put it like his Joker moment origin story, where he decides to wage war against all these laws that, you know, he just thinks are really kind of bothersome. So what he also learns is, in the great American political system, you don't have to actually break the laws. You can just preemptively start lobbying all of the state legislatures to
Right.
rewrite and change the laws. And so he wages this really, you know, extensive, elaborate campaign to deregulate state, you know, anti-monopoly laws as is what they really are,
Right.
in liquor markets.
But what's crazy is to bring it to the present day. So he's had these accusations. He's been, I believe, found guilty, his company, in a couple
Yeah.
instances of breaking these laws.
He was
And
fined
he's
in
now,
Connecticut. Yeah.
yeah, and he's now saying, I'm a victim. I'm just like you.
Yeah.
I'm a victim of the criminal justice system because I broke state anti-monopoly laws. Like it's and you relate it to sort of Trump saying that me getting indicted, you know, this is relatable to people because they've also had problems with the justice system, because everybody has overvalued their business holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just a common thing that happens in the country.
I mean, I just don't know how else you really describe this other than Trumpian. He's a white collar offender, and
Yeah.
he is, you know, basically tried to rebrand himself into a criminal justice advocate. And I just think it's kind of,
Well, and rebranded himself, by the way, using his prodigious fortune. I
yeah.
mean, he these donations to the ACLU to get some sort of criminal justice wing, or you could explain what it is, put in his name. You know,
Right.
he has sort of branded himself in this fashion, without sort of saying exactly what the offense was that he was allegedly railroaded around.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's not completely upfront about it. I mean, now these stories have come out, but the ACLU is actually very direct. Their page where they, you know, announced that they are naming one of their programs focused on recidivism. You know, inmates who, you know, are getting out of prison, have a tough time, you know, reintegrating basically back into life, getting jobs and such.
Yeah.
It's put in his name after he donated $15 million. They have a whole section on their page that's just a complete exoneration of what his record actually was. They basically say that this overzealous and corrupt regulator
Right.
was coming after him without getting into what the substance was, that he was actually
Right.
trying to circumvent these state laws, regardless essentially
Yeah.
what might have gone down in the litigation.
I mean, I don't know how this is going to fly, and what Brooks is going to make of it, but it should be interesting when we get into debates between the two,
Yeah.
how that issue plays out. All right. In the last 15 minutes here, it has been a huge week for anti-monopoly issues, and I want to go through a couple of those. I know there's a story you're working on that we can start with, which is that the Justice Department this week completed the sort of clean sweep of Biden administration lawsuits against monopolies in the tech industry with a case against Apple. This follows cases against Google, which already has gone to trial. There's another trial coming up. There's a case against Amazon. There's a case against Meta. And now we have the Apple case. And can you talk about what is the substance of the Justice Department's complaint against Apple?
Yeah, well, I mean, we can kind of tag team this a little bit, because I mean the lawsuit just dropped yesterday.
Yeah.
So Yeah, I mean, the kind of core of this is that Apple has become, their phones have become this ubiquitous product. But essentially, with that is kind of this gateway to any app development that you now want to make to reach people. You have to go through their store, and you have to go through their payment systems, all these other kind
Right.
of, yeah, all these other gateways that they've kind of
Well, I mean,
created.
it's
Yeah,
really about trapping people in the Apple ecosystem, right?
yeah,
So Apple has about it's about 50-50 between Apple and Android phones in the US. Android has more penetration globally, but Apple phones are it's a duopoly between them and Android in the US. And if you have the Apple phone, one of the things in the lawsuit says that you're really restricted from using things within the Apple ecosystem, things like payments, Apple Pay, for example, things like auto accessories, like putting your car keys onto your phone. There are other ways to do this in other countries where you have super apps where you can do a lot of the activity through the app and you don't need the phone. It doesn't really matter what phone you have. As far as Apple is concerned, they've blocked certain apps that would perform functions that they'd rather keep within their walled garden. And they have that gatekeeper ability because the only way generally that you get apps onto your phone, at least in the US, is if you use the Apple App Store. And so they're using that gatekeeper power to make sure that everybody who has an iPhone has to, use the various products and accessories that are within the iPhone. I think that's sort of the main thrust of the complaint.
yeah, that's right. And there are, I mean, just from a kind of cursory overview of the lawsuit, DOJ has gotten some, I think, pretty explosive comments from Apple executives that are more or less, laying this out, that this was part
Mm-hmm.
of their intention. Going back, I think, as far to conversations between Steve Jobs and several executives saying, if there are interoperable functions between Apple and Android, that's, not something that would be ideal for our business ambitions.
Yeah. So, I mean, stepping back here, we have now 4 monopolization cases, which, I mean, some of these actually the investigations and in some cases the lawsuits themselves started in the Trump administration. But basically, since the 1998 case against Microsoft, we haven't seen any of these in a 20 to 25-year period. And now we have every major tech firm under this investigation. It's in many ways the realization of the House Antitrust Subcommittee paper, which Lena Khan was staff director of the subcommittee at the time when that came out, about big tech. And so, I mean, we can talk about how this really is this sort of culmination of a long and very aggressive campaign by anti-monopoly reformers to return the government to a position where it's actually using its enforcement powers. Uh, what do you think of that aspect of it? That this is, it's the case, but it's also a signal of how the government has changed.
Yeah, I mean, also, I just maybe to frame this a little bit, it also is just good to think back to what antitrust meant just 6 years ago, during the Obama administration, where they would kind of go after cases that were more low hanging fruit, and oftentimes they would end in settlements. They wouldn't like really go all the way through the
Right.
court proceedings. I think if you had to give a scorecard for the antitrust enforcers now that they've gone after the 4 largest, most powerful tech companies in the world, I mean, you'd have to give them high marks. These are really ambitious cases. The Meta one, has had trouble in courts. The courts are still a bottleneck, and they just, they keep going for it. And it's also not just, I think, in some ways restoring antitrust. They've also gone after other litigation that is in a lot of ways kind of novel territory and ground. Like I'm thinking of the Kroger Albertson lawsuit that the FTC filed to block that merger that, as we wrote about, really foregrounds a lot of labor and even union concerns. And that's definitely something we haven't seen from antitrust reformers in decades.
No question. And it uses a theory of harm to workers which is completely outside the framework, the consumer welfare framework that we've seen over the last 40 years. Of course, the Justice Department won a case on a worker theory of harm. That was the publishing deal between Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House, which was really about author advances, that they would go down if it was a more concentrated market and there were fewer bidders for that labor, which is the labor of authors to produce their work. They would get smaller advances as a result. So we're definitely seeing a change, not only in the aggressiveness to use the law, but the application of that law. That harms to innovation are a problem, that harms to labor are a problem, that harms to an overall market ecosystem are a problem.
Yeah, and as I'm going to be writing about at some point, there are some far-reaching consequences of these lawsuits that are not immediately apparent. One of them in this most recent Apple lawsuit is there's a shocking amount of mentions and commentary in there about a product that people don't think about as much with Apple, but is really growing in power, which is its CarPlay product, which is becoming this kind of infotainment system for most new lines of automotives. And it's not just having apps on a screen. They're actually, the software that this is running on is becoming much more powerful in the full operations of these vehicles. And it's putting the auto industry in a really difficult spot because they're behind on the technology. They essentially have to outsource this to Apple or other tech players. This is putting Tesla aside because they kind of had some foresight in this one regard, at least.
Right.
And it's setting up this huge kind of battle of what the relationship is going to be between the companies that own the software, Apple, and the hardware of which the auto companies run on.
I can speak to this from a little bit of personal experience. I don't have an iPhone, but I have a Samsung Android phone. And when you go into your car and basically Android Auto starts up, and at least with my vehicle, I don't have to use that interface. I can switch back and forth between the interfaces of Volkswagen. You can switch back and forth between the Volkswagen and the Android Auto interface. But what I am given to understand through this lawsuit is that Apple doesn't afford you that opportunity. That if you go into the car, you're using Apple, and this CarPlay technology is really, first of all, not only is it sort of locking out competitors and locking out the ability to use other interfaces, but it's collecting a massive amount of data. And if you thought it was bad enough that you had this phone in your pocket that was collecting and knew everything about you, now it knows your driving habits. Now it knows your other aspects of your mobility that are very important to various aspects of whether it's ad targeting or what. I mean, in a related story this week, the Department of Transportation initiated an investigation into airlines who they say were taking passenger data, which passengers have to give up a lot of information for security purposes to get onto a flight, and using it to target ads at people at their seats, or to monetize that data and sell it to brokers, or to use that data in its greater knowledge of what prices it could impose on individuals. So we're seeing this connection between transportation data and technology in the airline context, and now with this Apple suit in the auto context.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's also sort of from the company side. If you just look at their statements about, what they see the prospects being for autonomous vehicles, it also very much has to do with this. If people aren't focused on driving, there's more time to, buy apps and, do other kinds of commercial activity inside their vehicles as well.
Great. Well, we just have like 2-3 minutes left. I guess we could talk about, let's bring up one last topic because I wrote about it today. The administration, the EPA, put out these new tailpipe emissions rules that are likely going to bolster the argument that the auto industry needs to transition to electric vehicles. In order to meet these regulations, you're going to have new auto sales in 2032, which is the last year this runs to, of as much as 56% or even more electric vehicles in that sales mix. And I looked at this actually from a labor perspective, because this week we learned that the UAW has filed for a union election at Volkswagen at their plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And that plant happens to be the flagship EV site for Volkswagen. It has a battery plant there, it has a battery engineering facility, and it makes the ID4, which is the first Volkswagen in EV in the US. I actually have one in the garage. So the election in Chattanooga, they've tried it twice before. And the major argument by opponents of unionization each time has been, if you go union, we're going to lose our products. We're going to see the plant shut down, and we're going to see this all go away. Because of these new regulations, that's not really going to be possible for Volkswagen. They have established routes, a logistics, a supply chain of the EV transition at Chattanooga. That's not going away because they now have compliance standards in terms of these tailpipe emissions rules to comply with. So the workers and the organizers can very credibly say, look, we can go union. They're not going anywhere here. We can collectively bargain for our rights. And if they win in the South, in Chattanooga, that is a powerful spur to potentially other wins all across that region of the country. And so it's not just about winning, how this sets up to help the union win in Tennessee. It's about how it sets up the union and other unions to win in the South. And I think it's a really big development. So that rant being done, we are just about out of time. Luke, thanks a lot for being here. I'm David Dayen. We have Luke Goldstein. Earlier we had Gabrielle Gurley. Thank you, the listening audience out there who are watching on YouTube. As always, we will put up an archive of this at prospect.org. You can expect that later today. And please keep coming back. We do this every Friday. It's a good way to catch up with the week and see what we've been doing, thinking about at the Prospect. And we'd love to have you along for the ride. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you next Friday. Thanks, Luke.